Philip's the director of strategy for Creative Scotland, and Shain is the managing director of a company called Sound Diplomacy. And Shain and I have been on the receiving end of many music export initiatives, hospitality around the world, and Shain is also run a music export initiative. So the idea of this panel was to get some ideas together, see what we could do in Scotland, and really get the conversation going about the potential for setting up a Scottish music export office. Now, Shain, you can speak at length about the different types of music export models that there are, but I think you've whittled it down into 3. Do you want to start and explain a bit what a music export office of any type usually does, and then just break it down into the 3 different approaches you've identified?
It's very hard because everyone does it differently. But over the years, so I helped develop and run the theoretical Canadian Music Export Office. It never was an official export office. I was hired by the Independent Label Association, the Canadian SMIA, to run it and to be their rep. And we sort of then acted as the first port of call to over 20 stakeholders in Canada from different regions in Canada and different genres and so on and so forth. So it was very political, and it was challenging at times. But what we did is we acted as the export office, because the one thing is you always want to have the path of least resistance to the buyer. That's what we always say. So when someone is interested in you, you have to ensure that you can concisely talk about yourself. And one of the goals of an export office is to be able to do that. So I found 3 ways. The first one is what we call a promotional, a promotional export office. And one of the examples of that is France. So they are a public-facing, consumer-focused promotional vehicle to promote a country brand within bands. So France, for example, I don't know if anyone has ever been to one of their showcases. They actually have a showcase brand called We Love, like O-U-I, love. And their objective is to promote France as well as promote their bands. They actually promote bands that aren't from France but are signed to French labels. So that's one side. The second side is what we call the Business Development Export Office. That's the one that you don't see. And that's the one that is based on just making friends within the industry, doing deals, and so on and so forth. And admittedly, it's the one that I prefer the most. One example of that is probably Norway. Norway does not do public showcases. They have a brand that they have with other people, but they don't do them. And that is mainly focused on business development. Not that promotion isn't focused on business development either. And the third one is what I call the Management Agency Export Office. And these are countries that don't actually have many music businesses in them. So the export office becomes a de facto management company. Luxembourg, for example, they have an export office that is essentially just a management company that is working with managers of these bands. Latvia is another country. I don't think that would be applicable here because Scotland is too big. And so those are the 3. It's promotional, business development, and what I call management agency, A&R. Does that make sense?
So to sum up as well, I mean, they're essentially going out there and helping labels, music businesses, artists get an international profile, be that through having a network of different industry contacts in certain countries, for example, what the Norwegians do here in Central Europe.
I'll be very simple. So an export office, the whole point of an export office is to be that person that can answer questions for the buyer. So the whole point is that someone came to me and says, do you know this manager in Canada? Do you know this band in Canada? And I probably do. So I can put them in touch. It's not to offer an opinion. It's not to A&R bands over another. Usually it's to be that neutral port of call for foreign business partners And that sometimes includes facilitating showcases at things like South by Southwest or Amsterdam Dance Event or Jazz Ahead or whatever. Sometimes it's doing club nights. Sometimes it's doing networking events. Sometimes it's running music conferences, because there are export offices that run their own music conferences. But the whole point is to provide a neutral, honest, trusted viewpoint of a sector. And the problem with a lot of export offices is the person or persons who are in charge also manage bands, also run record labels. And when you have a vested interest running an export office, it falls apart immediately. So the reason why I had a smidgen of success from one period of time is because I didn't manage or work with anybody. I was completely neutral, and I still don't really. And I think that's why I was trusted to a certain extent, or maybe not trusted. There's some people in the room going,
well, I certainly
idiot.
trusted you, Shain. So I think that already counts for something. You wouldn't be sitting here otherwise. The other thing that I think is interesting is that there's different models of financing. I mean, the Finns, for example, were set up by different music companies, so publishers and record labels in particular. They finance the early stages of the music export office in Finland. In Iceland, they had a mixture of different government ministries, including tourism, including the economy ministry, and also a couple of those dodgy banks that disappeared in the crash, but they managed to survive without those in the end as well.
Yeah, there's no model that's been proven to be the best. The Nordic model is you put the collection society, the label society, the publishers, all together, and they all co-own a usually non-for-profit association. Music information centers, which they don't exist in, well, I guess they do here in Scotland, but a music information center is a traditional kind of thing, mainly classical based, that are also stakeholders. That's one. In Canada, it's government-led. There's 13 export offices in Canada. There's the national one, and then each province, each region has its own. And then there's Quebec, which is its own country. In the U.S., cities have their own export offices, and then it's a number of different things. In Austria, it's the Arts Council that runs it, but there's usually a funder and a delivery agency. So that is the ideal, is the funder and the delivery agency are different, because if you give someone money and you do events, then it creates issues with neutrality. But there has to be a common goal between someone who's giving the money and someone who's spending the money, and they have to be different people. And that's how Australia is a good example of that. Australia's the government and the Australian Arts Council, but it's actually a third-party delivery agency called Sounds Australia that runs the export. And, I'm going to say they're the best. So I think Australia are the best example of an export office, probably because of the person who runs it.
Okay. So I think that's another interesting point, because in my experience, it's very often these organizations stand or fall on the person that's spearheading them and that's actually out there making the contacts. So I'd like to bring you into this, Philip, because you've got the overview, not just for music, but just for the creative sector in general. And also, I think it's interesting to get an insight into the type of policies and strategies that are being adopted by government here and different agencies in terms of exporting music. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how that's advanced, how things are coming along post referendum, because I guess quite a few things were on hold while people waited to see what the outcome would be in September.
Yeah, well, we were supposed to have been producing an international strategy by June last year, and I was sort of saying, well, hang on. The whole landscape's possibly going to change by September, so can we hang on to this one? And you're absolutely right. Politically, from a government point of view, since the referendum, things have actually moved on quite considerably, actually. In the last few weeks, in a month or so, Scottish Government has refreshed its economic strategy, and within that, the international framework that guides the principles for Scottish Government around international export and inward investment into Scotland. And for us as an organisation, for Creative Scotland, what's been really interesting is that in the shake-up since the referendum, that our sponsors within the Scottish Government, in terms of culture and international working, have come under one department now. So it's much easier now to link culture and internationalisation within Scottish Government. So suddenly I'm finding myself part of conversations that possibly I wouldn't have been involved in before, in terms of the Scottish Government's approach to internationalisation and how Scotland might export more effectively.
So are there any approaches that are proving popular or that are likely to be developed?
I think the most interesting, well, I think there's two elements to the international framework which could be very, very interesting in this respect. One is that there's always been a Team Scotland concept, but there's more of a push to make the public agencies work more effectively together as a One Scotland brand, so that where you're taking a concept out internationally, that it's linking different elements of investment in Scotland together. And in the new framework, it talks about piloting investment and innovation hubs, which are effectively little embassies in particular countries, which probably would be built on Scottish Development International framework. But you've got an office in a country that's leading on developing networks, developing relationships, and then linking across this One Scotland partnership as to how different elements of that trade network might link back into Scotland. So that's still very much in a pilot's phase, in a talking what it might be phase. But if that comes off and it is truly across the different agencies, that could be a really interesting way of making sure that there is linkage across different ways of developing trade.
So that would, if I'm understanding it correctly, it would mean that if I was interested in releasing in a market or knowing more about a market, I'd have a go-to person in Berlin or a go-to person in New York or London even.
That's possibly a way it would work. Certainly what you'd find, I think, is that the person in whatever country, in Berlin or wherever, would be developing those networks and linking it back to here, so that you would have a window, a door into that market that doesn't necessarily exist at the moment.
And do you think then, you've touched on this, the different agencies are coming together. One of the things that I've seen certain export offices do very well is work with their local tourism organizations or destination marketing organizations. So they get the exposure and the organizations get the exposure and manage to meet a lot of their aims, and at the same time they can then help out with flights or hotels and other things, and general promotion for the music events. I mean, do you think that there are moves towards that? Do you feel that there's conversations taking place with the likes of Visit Scotland or Glasgow Marketing or any of these kind of institutions?
I think we're getting there. It's the whole business support network in Scotland, I've found, to be polite, complex. It's very easy to get pushed from pillar to post within that landscape of business support. And the Holy Grail would be to sort of everybody know exactly where they fit in that landscape, and for anybody wanting to access those services to be able to go to any one of those and be told, well, you need to go to talk to this person, and that's where you'll get that support. And that is beginning to happen. It needs a lot more rationalisation, I would suggest.
I think this is a really interesting point because that's been my experience when, I coordinated a week of British bands for the BPI in Berlin 9 years ago. And when I went to do something similar for Scotland, I was passed around one agency to the next, and finally ended up being told that someone who was an organization's international guy could help me. And I hadn't actually seen this bloke at an international convention for about 5 years at that point. So do you think a simple solution, or I say simple in inverted commas, might actually be I love this word, to appoint a czar, someone that can actually bring those different elements together and maybe knock a few heads together where it's necessary?
I think that's beginning to happen anyway. I don't necessarily think that's a requirement now. I've been in Scotland for 15 months or so, and in that time, I've noticed quite a considerable change in the relationships across those different organisations. But it needs to work more effectively and not get caught up in different organisations' particular agendas, and accept the fact that what's important is what's right for the people that the organisation is supposed to be working for.
Shain, I mean, you'll have seen this and you'll have experience of this. I feel that very often these things are not necessarily about actually how hard it is to do them. It's actually more about having someone that can pull everyone together. Have you seen any examples of where this has been done very effectively, or any approaches which enable that to happen more smoothly?
Yeah, well, first off, I think that the industry itself here as well has to do that. So, speaking to the music industry in Scotland and my knowledge of it and my friends in it across genre and across sector, I think there needs to be some sort of common objective written out so it can be presented to these organizations, because these organizations, from my knowledge working in the countries that I've worked in, when you work with government, they want the solution before they're presented with the problem. So, and often these initiatives around the world, no matter where you go, have always been started by the industry first. The biggest fund in Canada, called Factor, which has given hundreds of millions of dollars to bands, was an industry initiative first. The government didn't get involved until 5 years later. And same in Norway, and same in Austria, and so on and so forth. You do need powerful, maybe that's not the right word, influential people to do that. And I think that there is, going back to me, I would go back to the industry. I would then find someone, whether they're in the industry or not, I think preferably in this case, not in the industry, to act as a mediator so that there can be a set of objectives, your top 5 wish list or whatever of what needs to be done. Because I think it has to be equally about business development. So I think that if you're focused on an export office, that's the end game. The exporting of something, going to South by Southwest, whether you believe it's the right thing or not, going to South by Southwest is 10% of 100%'s worth of work. 90% is in creating the effective business structures, companies and so on, in Scotland, paying Scottish taxes, that can facilitate these things. So the next Franz Ferdinand doesn't have to sign to Domino. They can sign to a Scottish label. For example, market forces aside. So I always think that if we're going to have some sort of Scottish export office, it actually has to take a few steps back first, understand what it needs to accomplish from an internal perspective and from a development perspective, and then it can go. And I think then it's a win-win for Visit Scotland, for Creative Scotland, for Scottish Enterprise, for all of these organizations that I think are looking for the path. They're looking for that straight road, and they're being given a windy path. And we've seen this in Canada. I'm working on this exact problem right now in a country that's way more complicated than Scotland. I can't say which one, but it's based on understanding what stakeholders want and then ensuring that there is a mechanism, whether that's a person or a system, that can extrapolate these objectives and then present them in a neutral way that across genre. So, I want, like, we need to have the electronic music community here represented. I know, there's the live sector, so on and so forth. Sorry, that was like a sermon.
Well,
I was rehearsing it in my head.
An outsider's perspective on this, though, as well, because I think that sometimes it's if you're actually living and working in a country, you can maybe be slightly blinded to what is required.
But this is not a unique problem. This happens everywhere, and every country has its own challenge, let alone every city. Like in the United States, people think that Americans don't give money to the arts. It's bullshit. They give tons and tons of money. Just the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Association, doesn't give any money comparative to its size. It's based on cities and mainly enterprise partnerships, like local enterprise partnerships that exist here in the U.S. The city of Denver gives more money per capita than the entire states of North and South Carolina, because the city of Denver has programs, for example. But, where I'm getting at this is all of this was led by the industry. All of this always starts off by the industry and then is brought into government. If I waited for the Canadian government to set up these export structures in the way that they needed to be set up at the time, nothing would have ever happened. Or we would have had Canadian Blast and then Canadian Rocks and then Canadian this and Canadian that, and we would all have been butting heads. And there are some countries where that still happens. Like there's a country in Eastern Europe where two people actually got into a fist fight a couple weeks ago because they both claimed to be the export office.
Oh, really? Was that Talent Music Week?
I can't say which country or who they were, but...
Damn it, I was there and I missed it.
No, it wasn't at Talent Music Week. Estonia is a good example. Yes, 1.3 million people, smaller than Scotland, but they have it on both sides. They have a couple of people who are influential enough to get people to the table, but those influential people aren't the ones doing the work. It's neutral people doing the work, and they have a really cool president who likes the Arcade Fire and the Smiths, but it's...
I don't know about the Smiths, but as regulars to Born to Be Wide will attest, but certainly he is quite a cool guy, because he was mentioning the Velvet Underground and Iggy Pop and stuff as well. Now, Philip, I'd like to bring you into this, back into this, because we've talked about overall government policies and the direction that things appear to be going in. But from a Creative Scotland perspective, where are you at now with developing an export structure, or what kind of things are you considering at the moment?
Well, there's two major pieces of work going on that I'm directly involved with at the moment, which is developing a strategy for the creative industries. Because Creative Scotland has, unlike any of the other similar organisations in the UK, it has a remit across arts, screen and creative industries. So it goes right from the intrinsic value of art right through to creative commercial. And we're in the process of really getting to grips with the creative commercial end and developing a strategy for that, which we hope would form the basis for a Scotland-wide creative industry strategy. Alongside that, I'm starting to develop our international strategy, which, as I say, we kind of put on hold a bit while the referendum was happening and the Scottish Government was sorting out what they were doing. So they're pieces of work that are in train now and very much linked in terms of developing that export strategy and bringing together the different partners, because as I say, the business support structure in Scotland is complex, in as much that for the creative industries, Creative Scotland is the lead organisation, yet the money to support creative industries sits with Scottish Enterprise, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, SDI, Scottish SDS, Skills Development Scotland. There's so many different agencies, and they all have the money, and we have the leadership, and it's a little bit complex.
So how do people from the music industry here feed into that consultation then, and into the whole process, so that they might be able to help shape it or explain what kind of priorities there are?
Where we're at with the creative industry strategy at the moment is that we did an initial consultation phase in the autumn, just before Christmas. Industry were asked to be part of that, but we found that we had a much bigger response from the education sector, the public sector. So we've taken a step backwards and we're doing a more targeted approach to industry consultation around that to get that voice into that process.
And how does the targeted approach work? I mean, do you, have you other specific organizations you're working with, or are you doing it on a kind of more informal basis of contacting key players that you've identified?
It's going to be a mixture. There are certain key players that obviously we've identified, and we're going to have one-to-one conversations with to get their input. The interesting way of doing it this way is that having done the initial consultation, we have a basic set of recommendations that we can test in this process. And we're also going to be running a series of workshops through creative industry networks that already exist across Scotland. We need to make sure we've got a pretty good geographic spread across Scotland to get that voice in there, and that we're getting that mix of businesses in terms of music industry, publishing industry, design, textiles, fashion, etc., etc. So we're going to set up a series of workshops with hopefully using those networks. The international strategy. At the moment, we're still at the pulling together all the different approaches that there are to export across the different agencies at the moment.
I mean, I think it's interesting that you mentioned the word agencies, because our experience is generally that a lot of the agencies don't really engage too much. So I'll give you an example. Last year I was invited to something where there were a lot of people it was a creative industries, event in partnership with people from Canada, as it happens. But there was one person in that room that actually ran a creative business, and so I'm always a bit alarmed when I think that there's organisations that speak for creative sectors, but or are actually appointed to do that, but they don't have too many practitioners. So my question is, how could people in this room get involved? I mean, I can see someone in the audience that's doing, developing an incredible business for example, to have festivals on cruise ships in Europe, and to partner that with tourism initiatives, where obviously there's a very strong international component to that, which is really relevant. But I'm not sure if those people are necessarily on the radar of certain organizations. So is there a way that it's possible for people to contact you or to feed into that process that we could maybe bring into the discussion today?
People can either contact me directly,
right?
And my email address is available on our website, I think. But when we've gone through this workshop approach, we'll also be putting whatever recommendations we come out with out to public consultation anyway. So there'll be a way of anybody to feed into that. One way to get to here, that will probably be by the end of June, I would have thought. You can sign up to Creative Scotland's newsletter by going onto the website, and we'll be publishing it through that. But as I say, if anyone wants to contact me, and I'll see if we can fit that into. Obviously, I'll talk to you.
That's
key
great.
People that we might be needing to talk to.
I mean, it'd be a pleasure, because I think that's something that ties in with what Shain was saying as well. That there are interested parties, and very often it's just really how you get them all around a table or into the same room. But I think maybe we can do that with the assistance of some good beer or something like that.
It's always,
Shain?
I guess, again, just from the industry side, it's about objectives. It's the people who benefit the most need to know what they want out of it before they ask. And we've learned that sometimes people just want this whole this concept of a music export office without actually knowing what it does and what it is and what its functions are. And there are export offices out there that act that way, I believe. And, we call them make work projects. They're there because someone needs a job. And I think that, the concise message from the content creators, so to speak, and the people who market and who benefit from those content creators has to come first, because again, then that helps with the core objectives within the consultation, which will then inform the creative strategy and then the international strategy. And that's the thing. It's I've learned that if you can get music industry development written into official strategies, it helps out quite significantly because it provides the institutional checkmark. Sometimes if strategies are written without even the words music industry, it can be difficult just because of things. And I think that in order to do that properly, as something like this is being written, there needs to be a message, a clear message from those people, not this person, this person, this person, this person, this person. You do that first and then come together as much as possible. And I think that people could do that here, at least from my cursory understanding of the Scottish music business,
So what I'm getting from this is we need sort of to speak with a unified voice, have someone that's a neutral party that doesn't necessarily manage artists or book artists, or so that there's someone that can be regarded as an honest broker with no sort of vested interest.
Running a music export office is an admin job. Simple as. You don't need to work in the music industry. And, some of the, I think that you need someone who isn't wowed by the bullshit of our industry. You need someone who just wants to put their head down and
I think that's
do the
an
admin.
interesting point, because I wonder if you can hit the ground running in that way. I mean, I think that there are people that I know that have very successfully run export offices because they know the music industry and because they already have contacts in it, but they are also have an understanding of how the outside world works.
It depends on this. It depends on the role. A figurehead and an admin person are different. I'm talking about an admin person. I think that there's enough opinionated figureheads in Scotland that can come together and form a a board, an advisory board, from a purely administrative purpose, which is why strategies are written and so on and so forth. It's better to do it, again, neutrality comes often from inexperience, or from, in the best possible way, ignorance. I don't mean that in a bad way, and I've found that it does help sometimes if people can't get along. Again, if whoever's in charge, if they manage a band, then it's not going to work. Like, it's like when you go to music conferences and then the person in charge of the buying for the music conference only brings in buyers who are suitable to the artists they manage, which unfortunately is the case in some places. Or just they do conferences and continually bring their friends year after year after year. And, I get frustrated with all this. I'm like, we're in this to create business. We're in this, so we have to do it from a...
Can I just interrupt you there quickly, because I'm conscious that Phil has to leave Phillips has to leave soon. Now, I wanted to ask you, we've talked very mainly about business, but Creative Scotland is an organisation that exists to support culture, and I think, or as well as business. So I wonder to what extent we can talk about a cultural export for the purposes of exporting culture, rather than it always having a business element to it. I mean, is that something that will inform your strategy as well?
Well, totally. I don't think that you can disaggregate the two. That the music industry is a prime example of it, where it spans the whole breadth of art for art's sake to a purely commercial product, and one feeds off the other and is supported by the other. So I don't think you can pull the two things apart. You have to look at it in the whole. So when you're talking about export, I think you're talking about culture generally. I don't think it's just the financial economic side of it. And developing those relationships internationally quite often start off with the cultural conversation, and it's a really good window into other countries, politically, diplomatically. It's a very good window into those markets, just by talking about general cultural sharing.
I just wanted to ask if you think maybe the term creative industries can itself be a little problematic, because it links many people, but these industries can have more that separates them than unites them, and it creates a culture of competition. And coming from a music industry perspective, I think we can sometimes be seen as the sort of low creative value upstart that sometimes competes badly against maybe, fine art or classical music and things like this. And do we need sort of more pure focus on individual creative industries rather than grouping them all together?
I totally agree with you on that. The concept of the creative industries is a purely false construct that has evolved over the last few years. And there's a different definition in England to what it is in Scotland, and there's different industries brought into that overarching thing. When you start trying to measure the impact and value of, certainly the economic value of creative industries, it gets even more complex, because you're talking about micro businesses. So you're talking about one or two people quite often that don't show up in terms of the VAT registers and things like that. So it's very difficult to capture that information. You've got, take the gaming industry. Quite often they will register themselves in terms of the toys industry rather than the creative industries, because that's how they can attract investment from big American companies that sit in that sector rather than in what we would call creative industries. So it's a completely false construct, and very, very difficult to... It's like herding cats, to be perfectly honest with you. But it does give us some way of showing the value of the cultural sector.
I wonder what industry isn't creative. Building a car is a pretty creative thing.
Yeah, accounting can be pretty creative.
Accounting can be pretty creative.
Has anyone else got a question? Felipe.
A bit of a self-interested question. I'm in a blues band here in Scotland, unsigned, small little thing. We did a 4-week tour of Colombia earlier this year with no support whatsoever. We'd love to be able to go back next year. Is there, or could there be, any support for us to do that from Creative Scotland?
I think, Philip, you're not really responsible for the sort of grant funds, but there are international funds and touring funds. So it's David Weaver. Could you? He can answer that question more thoroughly at the bar. Well, this actually gets back to an interesting point that Philip and I were discussing yesterday, where there are areas that seem to be very receptive to, or increasingly receptive to Scottish culture. And you mentioned that South America seemed to be developing as a place that's enthusiastically receiving Scottish culture.
Well, I think it's one of these issues that's as complex as the creative industries idea, because within that international framework for the Scottish Government, they are identifying priority countries. British Council have the same process of there are priority countries where they will put their energies in an investment. And in some cases that works, where there are key markets and you can use that. But the thing about artists is artists go where there are artistic collaborations, not necessarily economic ones. And Brazil is one of the really interesting areas. Firstly, there's a very proactive British Council office in Sao Paulo. And then you've got the link between the cultural programme that was around the 2012 Olympics and then going on to the 2016 Olympics, which was a link to develop cultural connections between the UK and Brazil. That has led on to very, very strong relationship across the whole of South America. So for us, a key priority area would be South America, where from a governmental point of view, it's North America. That might lead into a wider conversation around the Americas, but that is a purely artistically led relationship, not one that's economically led.
And there's so many opportunities down there, like from an industry perspective. Every one of those countries has export offices. They all have government agencies that work in this that you can contact, and they all have festivals and so on and so forth. So, yeah, go.
On a related note, this man sitting just in front of you can tell you a bit about the Fora do Exo initiative in Brazil, which is called Off Axis here. It was launched at Wide Days 2 years ago, and that can give you some interesting insights as well. So there's actually an Edinburgh band that can't make it to Wide Days this year because they're touring in Brazil for the second time. So I think there will be, there will be some things where you can maybe get some cash off Weaver there, or some advice on how to get cash, and then when you move over to Brazil, Jeff there can give you some advice. I think we're going to have to wrap up this panel now, but thanks very much for coming. Thanks for Shain and Philip for just giving us a more of an insight how we can one day set up an export office. And I think this is just the start of the conversation. So if you see us later on, come and have a chat about it if you've got any ideas. And as Philip says, his email's on the website, and he does get back in touch, because I dropped him an email a couple of weeks ago and it all came together. So thanks very much for coming along to the panel, and see you at the next one, which I believe is in 20 minutes. We've got Finny Tribe on here, and come and listen to what the pioneers of Scottish electronic music have to say. It's an interesting story. Thanks very much, guys.